Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we are not talking about the cults you already know. Not the ones with documentaries and true crime podcasts and a dozen breathless YouTube explainers already fighting for your attention. Tonight we are going somewhere quieter, into the dusty back rooms of history where entire movements rose, convinced thousands of people that the world was about to change forever, and then simply evaporated, leaving behind only a paragraph in a history book and a faint, uneasy feeling that something strange happened here. If tonight's wander through history helps you drift off, feel free to like the video and subscribe if it's genuinely useful to you. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is right now, because it is always somewhere between midnight and dawn for somebody. Get yourself comfortable, dim the lights, let a fan hum in the background if that helps, and settle in. We have a long night of forgotten history ahead of us. Let's start with a simple question. What does it actually take to convince 10,000 ordinary people to leave their homes, their farms, their families, and walk toward almost certain death, all because one man told them God wanted them to? What does it take to make a grown man believe he can command the sun? What does it take to make a nation of farmers burn their own crops and starve rather than doubt a teenage girl's vision? These are not questions with comfortable answers. But they are questions worth sitting with tonight, safely, from the other side of history, wrapped in blankets rather than standing in the cold waiting for a miracle that never arrives. Every story tonight follows a shape you will start to recognize, the same shape almost every gathering of true believers seems to take, whatever century or continent it happens in. First comes the crack. Something breaks in the ordinary world. A war, a plague, a famine, a humiliation too large to process, and people are left standing in the rubble of their old certainties looking for someone, and came for anything, to tell them the rubble means something. Then comes the voice. Someone steps forward, calm where everyone else is frightened, certain where everyone else is confused, and offers an explanation so complete it feels like relief itself. And then comes the promise, always outsized, always urgent, always somehow reserved specifically for the people listening. You are not just going to survive this. You are going to be part of something enormous. Keep that shape in your mind as we travel tonight, because you will meet it again and again in a Roman street, in a French field, in a New York tenement, in a Florida swamp. Same bones, different skin. Let's begin somewhere you might not expect. Not with a robed prophet or a burning tower, but with an old man on a donkey, riding through medieval Europe, and somehow convincing an entire continent to march toward Jerusalem. In the closing years of the 11th century, a small, wiry preacher known to history as Peter the Hermit rode from town to town, across France and Germany on the back of a donkey, and wherever he stopped, crowds gathered around him the way people gather around a fire in winter. He was not an impressive man to look at. Chroniclers of the time describe him as short, unwashed, and strange in appearance, riding an animal that seemed almost comically undersized beneath him. And yet something about the man commanded attention in a way that made grand bishops in silk robes look faintly ridiculous by comparison. To understand why an unkempt hermit on a donkey could move an entire population, you have to understand the mood of Europe at the time. The continent had spent generations absorbing waves of famine, plague, and near-constant low-grade warfare between feuding lords. The peasantry, in particular, lived lives defined by hunger, forced labor, and a church that promised salvation in the next world while offering very little comfort in this one. Then, in the year 1095, the Pope stood before a council and called for a great armed pilgrimage to reclaim the holy city of Jerusalem from its Muslim rulers, promising that anyone who died on the journey would have their sins wiped clean and walk straight into heaven. It was, in effect, the most generous offer any institution had ever made to the desperate poor of Europe. Skip the purgatory. Skip the decades of penance. Just walk east, and if you die trying, you are already forgiven. The official crusade that resulted from this call was led by trained knights and noblemen, organized armies with supply chains and commanders. But Peter the Hermit did not wait for any of that. He gathered his own following first, a ragged, overwhelming mass of peasants, minor clergy, the poor, the desperate, and quite a few people who simply had nothing left to lose. Estimates from the period, which should always be treated with some suspicion given medieval chroniclers' fondness for round, dramatic numbers, put his following somewhere in the tens of thousands. What is not in dispute is that it was enormous, entirely unprepared, and moving with a speed and hunger that terrified everyone it passed. This became known to history as the People's Crusade, and it deserves to be remembered as one of the strangest and most tragic mass movements of the medieval world. Peter preached that the end of days was approaching, that Jerusalem's liberation would usher in a new and glorious age, and that those who joined him were walking not merely toward a city, but toward salvation itself. His followers believed him with a totality that is almost impossible to imagine today. They sold what little they owned, packed what they could carry, and set out on foot across hundreds of miles of unfamiliar territory with barely any food, no real military discipline, and only the certainty of their leader's vision to guide them. The journey east was, from very early on, a disaster. A crowd that size needed food, and it did not have nearly enough, so it took what it needed from the towns and farmland it passed through, provoking clashes with local populations who had done nothing to deserve an army of hungry pilgrims descending on their granaries. In parts of the journey through Central Europe, the march curdled into something darker still, as some of the followers turned their fear and fervor against Jewish communities along the route, in some of the earliest and most horrifying instances of the violence that would recur throughout the crusading era. It is a detail history does not get to soften with time, and it should not be softened here either. A movement built on a promise of holiness produced, along the way, some of the least holy acts imaginable. By the time Peter's exhausted, diminished, and poorly organized crowd reached the outskirts of Byzantine territory, the local emperor took one look at them and, according to several accounts, tried gently but firmly to persuade them to wait for the proper trained army that was still weeks behind. Peter, or at least the momentum of his followers, would not wait. Impatience, after all, is one of the oldest features of true belief. If the promised land is close, who wants to stand still? What followed was catastrophe. The undisciplined mass pushed forward into hostile territory in Asia Minor, walked into a well-prepared ambush, and was slaughtered almost to the last person. Historians differ on exact numbers, as they always do with medieval battles, but the consensus is grim. The vast majority of Peter's followers, the very people who had walked hundreds of miles on the strength of a promise, died within sight of the goal they had been told was their salvation. Peter himself, who had left the main body of the march shortly before the disaster to seek supplies, survived, and would go on to accompany the official crusading army that followed behind, eventually witnessing the very capture of Jerusalem his followers had died trying to reach. There is something almost unbearably sad in that detail. The people who believed hardest, who gave up everything on the strength of a single man's certainty, were not the ones who lived to see the city. The man who lit the fire walked away mostly unscathed, while the fire itself burned out in the dust of Anatolia. It is a pattern you will see again tonight. The prophet, more often than not, outlives the promise. And yet it would be too easy and too unfair to call Peter simply a fraud or a manipulator. Most accounts suggest he believed in his own mission every bit as sincerely as his followers did. He was not living in a palace while his people starved. He walked with them, ate what they ate, and shared their hunger and their hope in equal measure. That sincerity is, in its own way, the most unsettling part of the whole story. It was not cynicism that killed those tens of thousands of people. It was faith, moving faster than caution ever could. The People's Crusade remains a strange footnote sandwiched between the grander, better documented story of the official crusades that followed. But it deserves to be remembered on its own terms, as one of history's clearest early demonstrations of what happens when desperate people meet an absolutely certain voice at exactly the wrong moment. It would not be the last time history saw children, and the poor marched toward a promised miracle with nothing but faith to protect them. Barely a century later, a version of the same tragedy would repeat itself, this time led not by a grown man on a donkey, but by children who believed, with heartbreaking sincerity, that their innocence alone could accomplish what armies could not. In the year 1212, a wave of religious fervor swept through parts of France and the German lands involving, according to the chronicles of the period, extraordinary numbers of children and adolescents who became convinced that they, and they alone, could succeed where armored knights had failed. Two young figures are most closely associated with this movement: a French shepherd boy known as Stephen of Cloyes and a German boy named Nicholas, each independently gathering crowds of young followers who believed that their very purity, untouched by the sins of the adult world, would part the sea before them and deliver Jerusalem into Christian hands without a single sword being drawn. Historians have spent well over a century arguing about what actually happened here, and it is worth pausing on that argument before going further, because it tells you something important about how these stories survive at all. Some scholars now believe the phrase "children's crusade" may have been something of a mistranslation or exaggeration of the original sources, that many of the participants may not have been literal children at all, but rather the poor, the landless, and the young unmarried laborers of the countryside, lumped together under a word that in medieval Latin could mean either children or simply the common, powerless people. It is entirely possible that the movement was made up of desperately poor young adults rather than literal 10-year-olds walking toward the Mediterranean. And yet the traditional story, however embellished by later retelling, still captures something true about the spirit of the age. An age willing to believe that innocence itself might succeed where military might had repeatedly failed. According to the most commonly told version of events, Stephen of Cloyes, a shepherd boy said to be around 12 years old, claimed that Christ had appeared to him and instructed him to lead a crusade of children to the Holy Land, promising that the sea itself would dry up before them just as it had for Moses, allowing them to walk to Jerusalem on dry ground. Word spread with the astonishing speed that religious enthusiasm always seems to travel at in these stories, and thousands of children and young people, by some accounts numbering in the tens of thousands, are said to have gathered and begun marching south toward the coast of France. What makes this story land with such particular heaviness is the detail, repeated across multiple chronicles, that many of the children's own parents tried desperately to stop them and were unable to. Locks and doors and pleading were reportedly no match for the certainty burning in a child who believes they have been personally chosen by God for a miracle. There is something in that detail that should chill you far more than any tale of a bloodthirsty tyrant. The image of ordinary mothers and fathers standing helplessly in doorways, watching their children walk toward the horizon, convinced that heaven itself was waiting for them there. When Stephen's followers reached the southern coast of France, the miracle they had been promised, understandably, did not arrive. The sea did not part. It simply sat there, vast, gray, and entirely indifferent to the faith of the children standing on its shore. What happened next depends heavily on which account you trust, and this is where the story slides from tragedy into something closer to horror. Several later chroniclers claim that merchants in the port towns, sensing an opportunity in the stranded, hungry, and directionless crowd, offered to provide ships to carry the children onward, ostensibly toward the Holy Land. According to this version of events, some of the ships were lost at sea in storms, while others delivered their young passengers not to Jerusalem, but into the hands of slave traders in North Africa, who sold them into bondage far from anything resembling the glorious pilgrimage they had been promised. It is important to be honest here about how much of this specific detail modern historians can actually verify. The slave trade element of the story appears in some of the later medieval sources, but is largely absent from the earliest and most contemporary accounts, which has led many scholars to treat it with real caution, as the kind of dramatic addition storytellers love to append to an already tragic tale. What seems most likely, stripped of the most sensational embellishments, is that the movement largely dissolved in confusion and disappointment once it became clear that no miracle was coming. Many of the young participants simply drifted back toward their homes, footsore, humiliated, and quietly absorbed back into the ordinary poverty they had marched away from. Others, especially those from the poorest families with nothing to return to, may well have been vulnerable to exactly the kind of exploitation the later legends describe, even if the specific stories of mass enslavement grew taller with each retelling. The German strand of the movement, led by the boy Nicholas, followed a similarly heartbreaking arc. His followers are said to have crossed the Alps on foot, an appalling journey for anyone, let alone poorly provisioned children, with many dying of exhaustion, cold, and hunger before ever reaching Italy. Those who survived the crossing arrived at the coast only to find, just as in France, that no divine ship was waiting to carry them onward. Most simply turned back, retracing their steps home through mountains that had already claimed so many of their companions on the way out. Nicholas himself, reportedly, did not survive the return journey, and it is said that his own father was later hanged by furious townspeople who blamed him for encouraging his son's fatal delusion, though the reliability of even that detail is difficult to confirm across the centuries. Whatever the precise, factual core of the children's crusade turns out to be once historians finish arguing over it, its endurance as a story tells you something important about why we are drawn to these tales at all. It captures, in its purest and most painful form, the same recipe you will hear about again and again tonight. A shattered world looking for a miracle. A voice, however young or unlikely, offering absolute certainty. And a promise so beautiful, so simple, that innocence alone could succeed where cynicism and steel had failed, that thousands of ordinary, frightened people were willing to walk into the unknown to test it. The tragedy is not that they were foolish. The tragedy is that they were hopeful in a world that had given them almost nothing else to hope for. From the muddy roads of medieval Europe, we travel back further still, to a desert plateau in the ancient world, where a small, fiercely devoted band of religious zealots chose a fate so extreme that their final stand is still argued about, and still visited by tourists, 2,000 years later. In the year 73 of the Common Era, on a barren rock plateau rising nearly 1,300 feet above the shore of the Dead Sea, the last defenders of a Jewish rebellion against Rome made a choice that has echoed through history ever since. According to the primary ancient source for these events, the historian Josephus, who was himself a Jewish commander turned Roman chronicler, and whose account must always be read with a careful, skeptical eye, nearly 1,000 men, women, and children chose to take their own lives rather than surrender to the Roman legion camped below them. The fortress was called Masada, and what happened there has become one of the most debated, most mythologized, and most quietly haunting episodes in ancient history. To understand how a mountain fortress in the Judean desert became the site of a mass death that still generates fierce academic argument 2,000 years later, you have to understand the desperation of the moment. The Jewish revolt against Roman rule had begun with real hope, a genuine uprising against an occupying empire that had grown increasingly brutal and extractive in its governance of Judea. For a few years, the rebellion achieved things that must have felt astonishing, driving Roman garrisons out of Jerusalem, minting their own coins, governing themselves. But Rome, as Rome always eventually did, returned in overwhelming force. Jerusalem fell in the year 70, its great temple burned to the ground in scenes of destruction that would define Jewish memory for the next 2 millennia. By the time the survivors of the rebellion scattered, most of the fight had gone out of the resistance entirely, extinguished under the weight of a Roman military machine that simply had no equal in the ancient world, except at Masada. A group of Jewish rebels known as the Sicarii, a name that referred to the small curved daggers they were said to carry concealed beneath their cloaks for use against political enemies, had earlier seized this remote desert fortress, originally built and lavishly furnished decades before by King Herod as a luxurious refuge and last resort stronghold. It sat atop a natural plateau with sheer cliffs on almost every side, accessible only by a narrow, winding path that a handful of defenders could hold against an army for a very long time. When Jerusalem fell, Masada became the final holdout of the revolt, a last island of defiance in a sea of Roman victory. The Sicarii who held it were not gentle idealists. Josephus, admittedly writing with his own complicated agenda as a man who had defected to the Roman side, describes them in deeply unflattering terms, accusing them of having raided nearby Jewish settlements for supplies, and of having been responsible for violence against their own countrymen, even as they postured as defenders of the faith. It is worth holding onto that complexity, because history loves to simplify a story like this into pure heroism or pure fanaticism, when the truth, as usual, sits somewhere far messier in between. These were people capable of both extraordinary conviction and troubling cruelty, which is, if we are honest, a description that fits most of the passionate movements you will hear about tonight. For roughly 3 years after the fall of Jerusalem, the defenders of Masada held their impossible position, watching from their clifftop palace as the wider rebellion collapsed around them. Then, in the year 73, a Roman legion under the command of a general named Lucius Flavius Silva arrived at the base of the mountain, and set about doing what Roman military engineering did better than almost any other force in the ancient world. Rather than attempting a costly direct assault up the narrow defended path, the Romans built an enormous siege ramp, an artificial mountain of earth and stone constructed against the western face of the plateau, a project that would have required a staggering amount of forced labor and represents one of the most impressive military engineering achievements to survive from antiquity in any recognizable form. You can still see the remains of that ramp today, a silent, physical reminder of just how determined Rome was not to let a single fortress of defiance stand unconquered. When the ramp was finally complete, and Roman siege engines began battering down the fortress walls, the defenders inside faced an outcome that had become grimly familiar throughout the revolt: capture, enslavement, and in many cases execution, or a life ending in the gladiatorial arena. According to Josephus, and this is the part of the story that has become legendary, the leader of the defenders, a man named Eleazar ben Yair, gathered his people and delivered a speech arguing that death by their own hand, freely chosen, was preferable to the certain degradation of Roman captivity. It is one of the more remarkable speeches to survive from the ancient world, whether or not it was ever actually delivered in anything resembling the words Josephus records, and it argues, with startling clarity, that liberty itself was worth more than life lived in chains. What followed, according to the account that has shaped the legend for 2,000 years, was a carefully organized mass suicide. Small groups of men were selected by lot to kill the members of their own families, and then a final small number were chosen to kill the remaining men before finally taking their own lives, so that no single person would be forced to bear the full weight of ending so many lives, and so that no one in the end would die entirely alone by their own hand, except the very last man standing. When the Romans finally breached the walls the following morning expecting fierce resistance, Josephus tells us they found instead an eerie and complete silence, the fortress full of the dead, and only a small handful of survivors, 2 women and 5 children who had hidden themselves in a cistern and lived to tell the Romans, and eventually Josephus, what had happened. It is, even stripped of any embellishment, one of the most striking stories to survive from the ancient world, and it became, especially in the 20th century, an enormously powerful symbol, a rallying cry for resilience and self-determination that found new resonance for the modern state of Israel. Israeli soldiers were for many years sworn in at the site itself, with the phrase Masada shall not fall again becoming a kind of national motto. Tourists still climb the mountain, or take the cable car if the climb feels like too much before breakfast, to stand where the defenders once stood and look out over the same unforgiving desert. And yet, in the decades since archaeological excavation began at the site in earnest, a more complicated picture has emerged, one that any honest telling of this story has to sit with. Excavations conducted from the 1960s onward found the remains of only a small number of bodies at the site, nowhere close to the nearly 1,000 that Josephus describes, which has led a significant number of modern historians and archaeologists to question just how literally the mass suicide account should be taken. Some scholars now argue that Josephus, writing decades after the events for a Roman audience, may have shaped or dramatized the story considerably, drawing on classical literary traditions that celebrated noble, chosen death over dishonorable surrender, traditions that would have been familiar and admirable to his Roman readers, even as they served to soften the brutal reality of a Jewish rebellion crushed by Roman force. It is entirely possible that some defenders did choose death, that others were killed in the final Roman assault, and that the full, tidy, philosophically elegant mass suicide described by Josephus is, at least in its most dramatic details, more legend than literal record. This uncertainty does not make Masada any less worth remembering tonight. If anything, it makes the story more honestly human. Whatever precisely happened on that mountain in the year 73, real people, pushed to the absolute edge of what a human community can endure, made a final, desperate choice about how their story would end, rather than allowing an empire to write that ending for them. Whether that choice was made by nearly 1,000 people in one coordinated night, or by a smaller number amid the chaos of a final battle, the underlying human reality remains the same: a community that had run out of any option except the manner of their own end, choosing to make even that into a final act of defiance. There is a thread here worth pulling forward into the rest of tonight's stories, because you will feel it again and again in the hours ahead. When people believe they stand at the absolute edge of history, when the ordinary rules of survival and compromise no longer seem to apply, the human mind reaches for meaning with a ferocity that can produce both extraordinary courage and devastating tragedy, sometimes within the very same decision. Masada asks us to hold both of those truths at once, without collapsing the story into either simple heroism or simple horror. From that desert plateau, we travel now across centuries and oceans, to the swamps and forests of colonial North America, where a different kind of fervor took hold, one measured not in mass death but in accusation, fear, and the terrible power of a community convinced that evil was hiding among its own neighbors. Long before the name Salem became shorthand in the American imagination for religious panic and mass accusation, a smaller, quieter, and considerably less famous wave of witch hysteria swept through the Connecticut River Valley, claiming lives decades before Massachusetts ever produced its most infamous trials. Tonight we are going to sit with that earlier, forgotten panic, because in many ways it is more unsettling than the story you already know, precisely because so few people have ever heard of it. The Connecticut colony's fear of witchcraft began taking organized, lethal shape in the 1640s, a full half-century before the events at Salem, in towns with names that still dot the map of modern Connecticut: Hartford, Windsor, Wethersfield, Fairfield. These were small, tightly bound Puritan communities, clustered along the river for trade and farmland, surrounded on every side by dense, unfamiliar forest that the settlers regarded with a mixture of practical necessity and deep spiritual dread. To the Puritan mind, the wilderness beyond the cleared fields was not simply empty land waiting to be tamed. It was understood, quite literally and sincerely, as the dominion of the devil, a howling waste where evil naturally congregated, pressing constantly against the fragile, godly order the settlers had carved out along the riverbank. Every crop failure, every sudden illness, every unexplained death of livestock, existed within a worldview that took the active, personal intervention of Satan and his human agents as an entirely reasonable explanation. The first recorded execution for witchcraft in the English colonies of North America took place in Connecticut, not Massachusetts, in the year 1647, when a woman named Alice Young was hanged in Hartford, though the surviving records of her specific case are frustratingly thin, reduced now to little more than a single line in a period diary noting that she had been put to death. We do not know with any real certainty what specific accusations were leveled against her, what evidence, if the word evidence can even be fairly used here, was presented, or how the community around her turned so completely against a neighbor they had presumably lived alongside for years. What we do know is that her death opened a door that would not close again for decades, establishing a grim legal and spiritual precedent that witchcraft was not merely a sin to be confessed and repented, but a capital crime to be tried and punished with death. Over the following years, the Connecticut colony would try dozens of individuals on charges of witchcraft and execute at least 11 of them, a toll that, when measured against the much smaller population of the colony at the time, actually represents a proportionally severe panic, even if the raw numbers never reached the scale of what would later happen in Salem. The pattern of accusation in these Connecticut cases followed a shape that should, by now, feel disturbingly familiar. It rarely began with a formal accusation from a magistrate or a minister. It began instead with the ordinary friction of small community life, a dispute over property, a sick child, a failed harvest, a personal grudge nursed quietly for years, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, that ordinary friction curdled into something the community could no longer process through its normal channels of gossip and grievance. Someone would begin to whisper the word witch, and once that word entered circulation in a Puritan town steeped in genuine, sincere belief in an active and personal devil, it proved almost impossible to fully extinguish. Consider the case of Mary Johnson of Wethersfield, tried and executed in the early 1650s, whose story survives in slightly more detail than most of her contemporaries, thanks largely to the writings of a prominent minister of the period who took an interest in her case. Mary was a servant, poor and of low social standing even by the standards of a colony that was not exactly generous to its poor, and she had already been punished on separate occasions for theft, offenses that, in the tightly moralized world of Puritan New England, marked her as someone of weak character, someone already halfway suspected of moral failing before any accusation of witchcraft ever touched her name. When the accusation did come, Mary reportedly confessed, and her confession, as recorded by the minister who interviewed her, is one of the more genuinely tragic documents to survive from this period. She spoke of feeling overwhelmed by her own poverty and low station, of a sense of hopelessness so complete that she had, in her own words as recorded by her interviewer, made some kind of covenant with the devil in a moment of despair, trading her soul for relief from a life that had given her nothing but hardship and humiliation. It is worth sitting with that detail for a moment, because it complicates the easy modern assumption that everyone accused of witchcraft in this period was simply an innocent victim railroaded entirely against their will by a hysterical community. Some almost certainly were exactly that. But others, like Mary Johnson, seem to have arrived at their confessions from somewhere genuinely internal, a mind so worn down by poverty, judgment, and social exclusion that the community's suspicion and the accused's own despair met somewhere in the middle, producing a confession that was, in its own devastating way, sincere. She was executed for her confessed crime, one more name added to a growing, largely forgotten list. The most intense and well-documented eruption of this earlier Connecticut panic came somewhat later, in the year 1662, in the town of Hartford itself, in an episode that modern historians sometimes refer to as the Hartford Witch Panic, and which unfolded with an intensity and speed that, on a smaller scale, genuinely foreshadows what would happen in Salem 3 decades later. It began, as these things so often did, with the illness of a child. An 8-year-old girl named Elizabeth Kelly fell suddenly and violently ill after what her family described as an encounter with a neighbor, a woman named Goodwife Ayres, whom the girl had reportedly quarreled with shortly before falling sick. As Elizabeth's condition worsened over the following days, she began, according to the testimony later given by her grief-stricken parents, to cry out in her fever that Goodwife Ayres was tormenting her, that she could see the woman afflicting her even as her parents sat helplessly at her bedside, watching their daughter suffer through symptoms that, read through modern eyes and with the benefit of modern medical knowledge, sound consistent with any number of natural childhood illnesses that 18th century medicine had no framework for understanding, let alone treating. Elizabeth died. Her parents, consumed by grief and searching desperately for some explanation for a loss that otherwise felt senseless and random, formally accused Goodwife Ayres of having caused their daughter's death through witchcraft. That single accusation, born from a grieving family's need to find meaning in an unbearable loss, did not stay contained to one woman. Within weeks, the town of Hartford was consumed by a wave of interlocking accusations, neighbor nomming neighbor, old grudges and half-remembered slights suddenly reinterpreted through the lens of supernatural malice. A woman named Rebecca Greensmith found herself accused, and under questioning reportedly implicated her own husband, Nathaniel, along with several other members of the community, describing in her testimony nighttime gatherings and diabolical pacts in language that historians studying the case have noted bears an uncomfortable resemblance to the kind of confession a frightened, pressured person under interrogation might produce in an effort to satisfy their questioners rather than an account of anything that actually occurred. Both Rebecca and Nathaniel Greensmith were ultimately executed. Goodwife Ayres, the woman originally accused by Elizabeth Kelly's grieving parents, managed to escape the colony entirely before her trial could be completed, fleeing with her husband into the wilderness rather than stand before a court she had every reason to believe would condemn her regardless of the evidence, or lack of it, against her. What makes the Hartford Panic of 1662 particularly worth remembering tonight, beyond its status as a genuine forgotten precursor to the more famous events at Salem, is the involvement of a minister named Samuel Stone and a physician of the period who together helped establish something that would become a recurring and deeply troubling feature of witch trials throughout the colonial period, a supposedly reliable test for detecting a witch. The test involved binding the accused and lowering them into water, on the theory that a true witch, having rejected the sacrament of baptism through their pact with the devil, would be rejected by the water in turn and float, while an innocent person would sink. Read that logic again slowly, because it deserves to be sat with. Under this test, there was no outcome that could actually prove innocence in any way that mattered to the person being tested. If you sank, you were, at best, dragged half-drowned from the water, having proven nothing except your own survival. If you floated, you were condemned. The water test offered the appearance of empirical, almost scientific rigor, layered over a process that was, in reality, no more reliable than the community's prior suspicions, dressed up in the language of proof to make an already predetermined outcome feel like justice. The panic in Hartford eventually burned itself out, as these episodes of collective fear generally do, not because anyone in a position of authority stepped forward to declare the whole process a terrible mistake, but because the accusations had begun reaching so far into the fabric of respectable town life that continuing to pursue every lead risked consuming the very community structure the trials were supposedly meant to protect. Some of the accused were acquitted. Some, like the Ayres family, escaped into the wilderness they had spent their whole lives being taught to fear, presumably judging the howling unknown forest a safer bet than a Hartford courtroom. Others were executed, their names surviving now mostly in court records and the occasional minister's diary, footnotes in a story that history would, 30 years later, choose to remember through a very different and far more famous set of trials happening a little further north and east. It is worth asking, as we sit here tonight in the comfortable dark, why Salem became the story everyone remembers, while Hartford and its earlier, comparably intense panic largely faded from popular memory. Part of the answer is simply the accident of scale and documentation. Salem's trials, though not dramatically larger in absolute numbers of executions, produced an unusually rich trove of surviving court records, and unfolded in a colony, Massachusetts, that would go on to play an outsized role in shaping the story America eventually told about its own founding. Connecticut's earlier panic, smaller in its surviving paper trail, and occurring in a colony that history would treat as something of a supporting character in the broader story of New England, simply did not get the same treatment from the historians, playwrights, and filmmakers who would later shape how Americans remember their Puritan past. But there is perhaps a more uncomfortable reason worth considering as well. Salem, precisely because it eventually produced a moment of public reckoning, jurors who later recanted, a colony that formally apologized decades afterward, a governor who ultimately intervened to stop the trials, fits more comfortably into a national narrative about learning from mistakes, about a young country stumbling toward wisdom through hard experience. Hartford's earlier panic offers no such tidy redemption arc. It simply happened, claimed its victims, and faded away without any of the dramatic reversals or public soul-searching that make Salem feel, however grimly, like a story with a moral. Sometimes history remembers the tragedies that teach us a lesson, and quietly lets go of the ones that only demonstrate, without any comforting resolution, how easily fear can turn neighbor against neighbor in a small, frightened community pressed up against a dark and unfamiliar wilderness. There is something worth carrying forward from Hartford as we move deeper into tonight's stories, a thread that will recur again and again in the hours ahead. Fear rarely announces itself honestly. It arrives disguised as grief, as concern for a sick child, as the entirely understandable human need to find some explanation, any explanation, for suffering that otherwise feels senseless and random. The people of Hartford were not uniquely cruel or uniquely foolish. They were frightened, grieving, and living in a worldview that offered them a dangerously convenient answer to the question of why bad things happen to good people. That same convenient, dangerous answer, in one form or another, will find its way into nearly every story you hear tonight. From the cold river valleys of colonial Connecticut, we travel now across more than 2 centuries and an entire ocean, to the sun-scorched hill country of 19th century China, where a failed scholar, convinced after a series of fevered visions that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ himself, would go on to lead a rebellion so vast and so destructive that it remains, by most estimates, the single deadliest civil war in human history. A conflict so enormous in scale that it makes almost every other story in tonight's long wander through history look small by comparison. In the spring of 1837, in a small village in southern China's Guangdong province, a young man named Hong Ziyuquan lay in bed for more than a month, drifting in and out of consciousness, consumed by a fever so severe that his family reportedly began preparing for his death. He had just failed, for the 3rd time, the grueling imperial civil service examinations that represented, in the rigid social hierarchy of Qing dynasty China, virtually the only path by which a man of modest background could rise into the ranks of the educated, respected, and secure. 3 failures was not simply a personal disappointment. It was, for a young man who had spent years of his life and his family's limited resources preparing for exactly this test, something closer to a verdict on the entire shape of his future. He collapsed, according to the accounts that survive, almost immediately after learning the results of his 3rd attempt, and did not fully recover his senses for over 40 days. What Hong experienced during those feverish weeks would, in time, reshape the course of Chinese history and cost an estimated 20 to 30 million lives, a death toll so staggering that it remains difficult to fully absorb even now, nearly 2 centuries later. While delirious, Hong reported a series of extraordinary visions. He described ascending to a heavenly realm where he was greeted by a venerable old man with a golden beard, who wept as he explained that the world below had fallen into wickedness and idol worship, and who then presented Hong with a sword and a seal, commanding him to return to the earth and cast out the demons that had corrupted it. In this same vision, Hong encountered a middle-aged man whom he addressed, in the account he gave years later, as elder brother, a figure who assisted him in his struggle against the demons of the vision. For years after his recovery, Hong did not fully understand what these visions meant. He returned, somewhat deflated, to his previous life as a village schoolteacher, and even sat for the imperial examinations a fourth time, in 1843, failing once again. It was only after this fourth and final failure that the pieces of Hong's earlier fever visions began to click into a shape that would change everything. A cousin lent him a set of Christian missionary pamphlets, translated tracts that had been circulating in the region, thanks to the small but growing presence of Protestant missionaries along China's southern coast. Reading these pamphlets, Hong experienced what he described as a moment of sudden, overwhelming clarity. The old man with the golden beard from his fever vision, he now understood, had been God the Father, and the middle-aged man who had helped him fight the demons, the figure he had addressed as elder brother, could only have been Jesus Christ, which meant, by Hong's own increasingly confident reasoning, that he himself was Christ's younger brother, a second son of God, sent to earth with a divine mission to cast out not literal demons, but the corrupt Qing dynasty and the false idols of traditional Chinese religion that Hong had come to believe were poisoning his homeland. It is worth pausing here on just how much genuine, sincere conviction sits underneath what might otherwise sound like an almost absurd claim. Hong was not a cynical con artist constructing an elaborate lie for personal gain, at least not in any way the surviving evidence suggests. He appears to have believed his own revelation with total, unwavering sincerity, and he spent the following years developing an entire theological system around it, blending fragments of Christian teaching absorbed from missionary pamphlets and brief interactions with actual Western missionaries, with traditional Chinese moral philosophy, and a fierce, genuine outrage at the corruption and suffering he witnessed all around him in Qing dynasty China. The result was a syncretic new religious movement he called the Society of God Worshippers, which began, modestly enough, as a small community in the hill country of Guangxi province, gathering together the poor, the marginalized, and the ethnically Hakka minority to which Hong himself belonged, a group that had long faced discrimination and economic disadvantage within the broader Chinese social order. The appeal of Hong's new faith to these communities becomes considerably easier to understand once you account for the extraordinary suffering gripping southern China at the time. The Qing dynasty, by the middle of the 19th century, was a government in visible, accelerating decline, weakened by corruption, crushing taxation, a series of humiliating military defeats to Western powers including the deeply destabilizing Opium Wars, and a population that had grown far faster than the agricultural economy could comfortably support. Famine, banditry, and ethnic tension between different communities competing for increasingly scarce land were endemic across the region. Into this landscape of genuine, widespread desperation, Hong offered something extraordinarily appealing, a vision of a coming heavenly kingdom of great peace, a new earthly order in which land would be redistributed equally among all people, in which the corrupt Qing dynasty and its Manchu rulers, viewed by Hong and many of his Han Chinese followers as illegitimate foreign occupiers, would be swept away entirely, and in which the poor and the marginalized would finally be lifted up. The Society of God Worshippers grew with startling speed throughout the late 1840s, and as it grew, So did the alarm of local Qing authorities, who watched with mounting concern as this strange new religious movement began organizing itself along increasingly military lines, stockpiling weapons and drilling its members. In January of 1851, Hong formally declared the establishment of his new state, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, taking for himself the title of Heavenly King, and openly declaring rebellion against the Qing dynasty he had come to believe was populated by demons in human form. What followed was not a small, localized uprising of the kind that periodically flared up and burned out across the vast territory of Qing China. It was the beginning of a full-scale civil war that would rage for 14 years and eventually involve millions of combatants on both sides. The Taiping forces, fueled by genuine religious conviction, a coherent and appealing ideology of social reform, and increasingly effective military organization, achieved a string of startling early victories, sweeping north out of Guangxi and eventually capturing the great city of Nanjing in 1853, which Hong renamed the Heavenly Capital and established as the seat of his new kingdom. At the height of its power, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom controlled a vast swath of southern and central China, encompassing tens of millions of people, and implemented a genuinely radical program of social reform that included the prohibition of foot binding, a painful and crippling practice imposed on Chinese women for centuries, the abolition of private land ownership in favor of a system of communal distribution, and a strict, austere moral code that banned opium, tobacco, alcohol, and gambling among the faithful. Hong also implemented a rigid separation of the sexes even within families, and enforced a form of shared communal property that echoed, in its own distinctly Chinese theological framing, some of the same communal utopian impulses you will hear about later tonight in an entirely different corner of the world. But as the Taiping Kingdom expanded, and its early revolutionary fervor calcified into the machinery of an actual governing state, the movement began to display the same pattern you have already seen tonight in miniature, and will see again before the night is through. Hong Ziyuquan, having declared himself the literal younger brother of Jesus Christ, and installed himself as absolute ruler of an enormous kingdom, gradually withdrew from the day-to-day business of governing and warfare, retreating deeper into his palace and his religious visions, leaving the practical administration of his rebellion to a group of subordinate kings he had elevated to positions of enormous power. Chief among these was a former charcoal burner named Yang Ziyuqing, who had risen to prominence within the movement partly through his own claimed ability to channel the voice of God the Father directly, falling into trances during which he would speak with an authority that even Hong himself, as the supposed Son of God, could not easily contradict without undermining the entire theological structure his kingdom was built upon. This arrangement, unsurprisingly, proved catastrophically unstable. In 1856, in an episode that historians of the rebellion often point to as the single most consequential turning point in the Taiping Kingdom's fortunes, a violent internal power struggle erupted among the movement's leadership. Yang Ziyuqing, whose direct channeling of God the Father's voice had made him arguably the most powerful figure in the kingdom in practical terms, was assassinated on Hong's orders, along with, according to most estimates, several thousand of his followers and family members in the purge that followed. The bloodletting did not stop there. Another of the kingdom's senior leaders, implicated in the plot against Yang, was subsequently killed as well, along with thousands more of his own supporters, in a spiraling cycle of internal violence that historians estimate claimed tens of thousands of lives within the Taiping leadership and its supporting factions alone, before the rebellion had even begun facing its most serious external military pressure. A kingdom that had been founded on a promise of heavenly peace had, within just a few years of achieving real power, turned savagely and lethally upon itself. The rebellion never fully recovered its earlier momentum after this internal catastrophe, though the war itself would grind on for nearly another decade, becoming one of the most brutal and destructive conflicts in recorded human history, marked by repeated sieges, mass starvation in besieged cities, and a scale of civilian suffering that is genuinely difficult to convey in numbers alone. Qing dynasty forces, eventually reorganized and strengthened with the assistance of regional armies raised by provincial officials, and in the later stages of the conflict supported by foreign-officered mercenary forces including, in one of history's stranger footnotes, an American adventurer and a British officer who would later become famous for his death at Khartoum, gradually clawed back territory from the Taiping Kingdom throughout the early 1860s. Hong Xiuquan himself, as the noose of the Qing counteroffensive tightened around his capital at Nanjing in the final months of the rebellion, retreated ever further into religious conviction and increasingly erratic behavior, reportedly refusing to flee the doomed city even as starvation set in among his remaining followers, and insisting instead that heavenly manna would sustain them if their faith remained strong enough. He died in June of 1864, just weeks before Nanjing finally fell to Qing forces, and the cause of his death remains genuinely disputed among historians to this day, with some accounts suggesting illness, and others suggesting that Hong, facing the certain collapse of his 14-year kingdom, may have taken his own life by poison rather than face capture. When Qing troops finally breached the walls of Nanjing shortly afterward, the resulting massacre and destruction brought a brutal, bloody close to one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, a rebellion that had begun in the fevered visions of a single failed scholar and ended with a death toll that, by most modern estimates, sits somewhere between 20 and 30 million people. A figure that places the Taiping Rebellion among the very deadliest conflicts of any kind in the entire span of recorded human history, ranking alongside or even exceeding the total losses of the Second World War in some estimates, though comparing death tolls across such different eras and circumstances is always an imprecise and uncomfortable exercise. There is a great deal to sit with in the story of Hong Xiuquan, and very little of it offers easy comfort. Here was a man whose personal disappointment, a failed examination that closed off his path to a comfortable, respected life, curdled through fever and grief, and a chance encounter with foreign religious pamphlets into a conviction so total that it eventually cost tens of millions of lives. And yet, threaded through all of that catastrophic violence, sat a genuine, sincere vision of a more just world, an end to foot binding, an end to land monopolized by a wealthy few, a rejection of the opium that Western powers had forced onto Chinese society at gunpoint only a few years earlier. The same fevered conviction that produced staggering brutality also produced, at least on paper, one of the more genuinely progressive social programs of its era, a reminder of a theme that will recur throughout tonight's stories, that the line between visionary reform and catastrophic delusion is very often thinner, and very much stranger than we would like to believe. From the burned ruins of Nanjing, we travel now to a considerably quieter corner of history, back across the Pacific to the young United States, where a very different kind of prophet, promising not the end of an empire but the end of the world itself, would gather tens of thousands of ordinary American farmers, shopkeepers, and families, convince them the sky itself was about to open, and then watch, alongside all of them, as an entirely ordinary autumn morning simply refused to cooperate. In the autumn of 1830, on the streets of Lower Manhattan, a Scottish-born carpenter named Robert Matthews began telling anyone who would listen that he was not, in fact, Robert Matthews at all, but the prophet Matthias, a vessel through which the Spirit of God the Father himself now spoke directly to humanity. It is one of the stranger and more disturbing stories to emerge from the intensely religious ferment of early 19th century America, a period so thick with new prophets, new revivals, and new movements that historians have taken to calling it the Second Great Awakening. And out of that awakening, few figures cut a stranger or more troubling shape than the man who would come to call himself Matthias the prophet. To understand how a carpenter could convince a small but devoted following of prosperous, respectable New Yorkers that he was the literal voice of God on earth, you first have to understand the peculiar religious atmosphere of the time and place. Upstate New York and the growing cities of the American Northeast were, in this period, experiencing waves of religious revival so intense and so frequent that the region would later earn the nickname the Burned-Over District, a landscape so repeatedly swept by the fires of religious enthusiasm that observers joked there was little spiritual fuel left to burn. It was in this same charged environment, in these same years and often these very same towns, that a young man named Joseph Smith would soon found what became the Latter-day Saint movement, that spiritualism and the notion of communicating with the dead would take hold and spread like wildfire, and that any number of smaller, stranger prophetic movements would rise, briefly flourish, and vanish. Robert Matthews was simply one prophet among many competing for attention in an atmosphere unusually receptive to the idea that God might, at any moment, choose to speak directly and personally to an ordinary human being. Matthews himself had a restless and unstable early life that gives little obvious hint of the strange path he would eventually walk. Born in New York State to a family of Scottish Presbyterian farmers, he trained as a carpenter, married, had children, and drifted through a series of small towns and small failures, a store that collapsed, debts that mounted, a temperament that friends and family increasingly described as erratic and consumed by religious obsession. By his own later account, he experienced a series of powerful religious visions in the late 1820s that convinced him he had been chosen for an extraordinary purpose, and by 1830 he had abandoned his family entirely, grown out a long beard in the style he believed the biblical prophets would have worn, and begun wandering the streets of New York City, declaring to startled passers-by that the spirit of Matthias, one of the lesser-known apostles mentioned briefly in the biblical book of Acts, had entered into him, and that through this vessel, God the Father himself was now prepared to speak. What might easily have remained the story of one more eccentric street preacher, of which early 19th century American cities had no shortage, took a genuinely strange turn when Matthews's path crossed with a small, tight-knit religious community already gathered around a prosperous and deeply devout New York merchant named Elijah Pierson. Pierson was, by all accounts, a man of real wealth and real sincerity, who had already been drawn deep into an intense, mystical strand of evangelical Christianity following the death of his beloved wife, an event that had shattered him and left him searching with an almost desperate hunger for direct, unmediated contact with the divine. Pierson had convinced himself, even before meeting Matthews, that he possessed the biblical gift of prophecy, and had gathered around himself a small community of similarly devout, similarly wealthy followers who met regularly for intense prayer and religious study, believing themselves to be living, in some sense, outside the ordinary rules and denominations of conventional American Christianity. When Matthews arrived at this community and announced himself as the literal embodiment of God the Father's Spirit, Pierson did not react with the skepticism you might expect from an educated, prosperous New York businessman. Instead, according to the detailed accounts that survive from this period, largely thanks to the sensational newspaper coverage the story would later generate, and a lengthy contemporary account written by a journalist who investigated the group directly, Pierson became rapidly and completely convinced that Matthews was exactly who he claimed to be. Matthews, for his part, proved remarkably skilled at the specific kind of theological argument that would appeal to a wealthy, guilt-ridden, grieving man, already primed to believe that ordinary religious institutions had failed him. He preached that the various Christian denominations competing for souls across the American landscape were all, in their institutional forms, corrupt and false, that the true Spirit of God had abandoned conventional churches entirely, and that only through submission to Matthias, the living vessel of the Father, could true believers access authentic divine truth and be gathered into what he called the kingdom. Under Matthews's increasingly confident leadership, this small community relocated to a rural property Pearson owned in Westchester County, north of the city, which they came to call Zion Hill, and began living communally under a set of rules and hierarchies that Matthews dictated with absolute, unquestioned authority. He declared that he alone held the true priesthood inherited from the biblical patriarchs, and used this claimed authority to install himself as supreme spiritual and, increasingly, practical head of the household, controlling the group's substantial shared finances, largely drawn from Pearson's considerable personal wealth, and making pronouncements on everything from religious doctrine to the most intimate details of his followers' domestic lives. It was within this small, isolated, financially wealthy but psychologically closed community that the story takes its darkest and most disturbing turn, one that echoes forward through the entire history of high-control religious movements right up to the present day. Matthews began teaching a doctrine of what he called spiritual marriage, or match spirits, arguing that God had revealed to him which members of the community were truly, spiritually matched to one another, regardless of their existing, legally recognized marriages, and that these divinely ordained pairings superseded the conventional marriage vows the members had made before joining the group. Under this doctrine, Matthews eventually installed himself in an intimate domestic relationship with the wife of one of his followers, a wealthy businessman named Benjamin Folger. While Folger's actual wife's original husband was pushed to the margins of the household, expected to accept this rearrangement as a matter of divine revelation delivered through the prophet's unquestionable authority, the community at Zion Hill survived in this strange, insular, financially precarious state for roughly 2 years, sustained largely by Pearson's dwindling personal fortune and by Matthews's absolute psychological hold over his small circle of followers. It began to unravel, as these things so often do, through a combination of internal financial strain, growing unease among some of the followers' extended families who had watched loved ones sign over property and independence to an increasingly demanding prophet, and finally, tragedy. In 1834, Elijah Pearson, the wealthy merchant whose grief and devotion had helped fund and sustain the entire community from its earliest days, died suddenly and somewhat mysteriously. His death, following what witnesses described as a violent physical seizure, immediately raised suspicions among Pearson's own relatives, who had never trusted Matthews and who now suspected the prophet of having poisoned their kinsmen, whether to seize more direct control over the group's remaining finances or simply out of the kind of erratic, controlling paranoia that had come to define Matthews's leadership by this point. What followed was one of the most sensational criminal trials of the era, a genuine tabloid spectacle that captivated readers across the young republic and drew extensive, breathless newspaper coverage, detailing every strange aspect of the group's beliefs and practices to a scandalized and fascinated public. Matthews was formally charged with Pearson's murder, and the trial that followed exposed the full, bizarre structure of the Zion Hill community to public view for the first time, the claimed divine authority, the reassigned spiritual marriages, the absolute financial and psychological control the prophet had exercised over his small circle of wealthy, previously respectable followers. Robert Matthews was ultimately acquitted of the murder charge itself, the prosecution unable to establish convincing evidence that Pearson had actually been poisoned, rather than dying of natural causes brought on by the physical and psychological strain of his final years, though he was separately convicted on lesser charges related to assault and financial impropriety within the community. The kingdom of Matthias, as the press of the era took to calling it, collapsed entirely in the aftermath of the trial, its remaining members scattering, its wealthy patron dead, its prophet publicly exposed and thoroughly humiliated in the newspapers that had turned his strange, isolated household into a matter of national fascination and scandal. Matthews himself drifted westward after his release, reportedly making a brief and equally unsuccessful attempt to attach himself to the newly emerging Latter-day Saint community in Ohio, where Joseph Smith, still building his own new religious movement, apparently found Matthews's claims and manner unconvincing and sent him on his way after only a short stay. He eventually vanished from the historical record entirely, his final years and death lost to obscurity, a strange final irony for a man who had once convinced a circle of prosperous, educated New Yorkers that he was the literal voice of God the Father speaking directly into the modern world. The story of the Kingdom of Matthias offers a particularly clear illustration of a pattern worth sitting with as we move deeper into tonight's long history, because it strips away some of the larger, more dramatic scale of movements like the Taping Rebellion or the medieval crusading fervor, and shows the same underlying mechanism operating in miniature, within a single household, among people who by any ordinary measure should have known better. Elijah Pearson was not poor, uneducated, or desperate in any conventional material sense. He was a wealthy, successful New York merchant, and it was precisely his wealth and his freedom from ordinary material worry that gave him the space to become consumed instead by a different kind of hunger entirely. A hunger for meaning, for certainty, for direct, unmediated contact with the divine, following the devastating loss of his wife. Matthias understood, whether through calculation or through his own genuine, deranged conviction, exactly how to fill that specific hunger, and the result was a small, strange, ultimately tragic kingdom that lasted barely 2 years before collapsing into scandal, and an unsolved question of poison that history has never fully answered. There is something worth carrying forward from this story into the rest of tonight's long wander through forgotten history. Grief, more than perhaps any other human experience, seems to open a particular kind of door, a vulnerability to absolute certainty precisely because grief itself feels so chaotic, so unbearable in its lack of explanation or resolution. Elijah Pearson wanted, more than anything, a universe that made sense again after his wife's death, a universe with clear rules, clear authority, and a direct line to the divine that might somehow restore some of what he had lost. Robert Matthews offered him exactly that, wrapped in the confident, unwavering language of prophecy, and Pearson, wealthy and educated as he was, walked willingly through the door that grief had opened. From the scandal-soaked parlors of 1830s Manhattan, we travel now to the isolated, windswept hills of rural California, nearly a full century later, where a very different kind of prophet, promising not spiritual marriage but literal physical eternal life, would build a colony so successful, so seemingly rational in its methods, that it would attract doctors, lawyers, and educated professionals from across the country, all convinced that death itself had finally, at long last, been defeated. In the summer of 1948, in a remote, brush-covered canyon in the hills above Los Angeles, a heavy-set, bearded man calling himself Krishnaventa arrived with a small group of devoted followers and began building what he called the Fountain of the World, a communal colony organized around his claim to be a being who had lived many times before across the history of the universe, who could not truly die, and who had been sent to Earth this time, specifically, to save a chosen group of followers from the apocalyptic destruction he insisted was coming soon in the form of nuclear war. It is a story that has largely faded from public memory outside of Southern California, overshadowed by the larger, more infamous cults that would follow in the same region decades later. But it deserves to be remembered tonight, both for its genuinely strange theology and for the violent, tragic end that would eventually consume it. The man who called himself Krishnaventa had been born under considerably less exotic circumstances, as Francis Herman Penkovic in San Francisco in 1911, and had lived a restless, often troubled early life that included stints of vagrancy, a period of wartime military service that ended in a court-martial and imprisonment for desertion, and a series of drifting years across the country during which, according to his own later account, he began experiencing profound spiritual revelations about his own true cosmic identity. By his own telling, which grew more elaborate with each retelling over the years, he was not an ordinary man at all, but a divine being who had lived on Earth many times across the millennia, present at pivotal moments throughout human history under different names and identities, and who had now arrived in mid-20th century America, in the shadow of the atomic bomb, to gather together a righteous remnant who would survive the coming destruction of the world and help rebuild civilization afterward. It is worth pausing here on just how perfectly this particular message was calibrated for its specific historical moment. The late 1940s in America were defined by a very particular, very new kind of existential dread, the sudden, world-altering knowledge that human beings now possess the technological capacity to destroy civilization itself in a matter of hours, a fear that had settled into the American psyche almost overnight following the atomic bombings that ended the Second World War, and that only intensified as the Soviet Union developed its own nuclear arsenal, and the Cold War settled into its long, anxious standoff. Into this genuinely new and disorienting kind of fear, a fear that no previous generation of Americans had ever had to carry, Krishna Venta offered something extraordinarily specific and extraordinarily comforting, not a vague promise of spiritual salvation in some distant afterlife, but a concrete, physical plan for surviving the literal apocalypse that seemed, to many anxious Americans of the period, to be a very real and very imminent possibility. The colony he established, which took the formal name the Fountain of the World but was more commonly known by the acronym WKFL, standing for Wisdom, Knowledge, Faith, and Love, was built in a rugged, isolated canyon in what is now the Chatsworth area on the northern edge of the San Fernando Valley, a location chosen, according to Venta's own teachings, for its specific spiritual and geological suitability to survive the coming catastrophe. Followers who joined the community adopted simple, monk-like robes, took vows of poverty and communal living, and organized their daily lives around a rigid schedule of shared labor, communal meals, and worship centered on Venta's teachings, which blended elements of Christianity, Eastern religious concepts absorbed and reinterpreted through Venta's own idiosyncratic theology, and a genuinely novel cosmology in which Venta himself served as the central, eternal, unifying figure across all of human history and all of the world's religious traditions. What made the Fountain of the World genuinely distinct from many of the era's other small religious communities, and what allowed it to grow into a functioning, self-sustaining colony of several hundred followers at its peak, was Venta's shrewd emphasis on practical, visible good works alongside his more exotic cosmic claims. The colony's followers became locally, and eventually nationally, known for their disaster relief work, showing up with trucks and volunteer labor to assist in the aftermath of floods, wildfires, and other emergencies across Southern California throughout the 1950s. Work that earned the group considerable positive press coverage, and a degree of genuine local goodwill that stood in sharp contrast to the deep public suspicion that would later come to define how Americans regarded unconventional religious communities. For a period of years, the Fountain of the World was regarded by many of its neighbors not as a strange, threatening cult, but as an eccentric, harmless, even admirable community of volunteers who happened to hold some unusual beliefs about their leader's cosmic identity. Beneath this public-facing image of wholesome disaster relief work, however, the community operated with an internal structure that followed a pattern you have already encountered several times tonight in different costumes. Venta exercised absolute, unquestioned authority over every aspect of his followers' lives, from their labor and their finances to, according to numerous accounts that would later emerge considerable control over their personal relationships and family structures. Followers who joined the colony typically surrendered their outside possessions and income to the community, and children raised within the colony were educated according to Venta's own curriculum, largely isolated from the conventional American life unfolding just beyond the canyon's rim. As the years passed and the community grew, tensions began emerging both within the colony itself and between the group and some of the wider families of its members. Tensions that echoed, in their basic shape if not their specific details, the same family conflicts that had torn at the edges of Robert Matthews's kingdom of Matthias more than a century earlier. The most serious and ultimately most consequential source of internal tension emerged in the late 1950s, when two former members of the colony, men who had left the community after growing disillusioned with Venta's leadership, began publicly and privately accusing Venta of sexual improprieties involving their wives, who had remained within the colony, alleging that Venta had used his claimed divine authority to justify sexual relationships with the wives of his own followers. A specific and painfully familiar pattern that echoes back through numerous stories across the long history of high-control religious movements, from the spiritual marriages of the kingdom of Matthias forward, through to movements you will hear about later tonight. The two aggrieved former members, having failed to receive what they considered adequate acknowledgement or resolution of their grievances, ultimately resorted to an act of shocking, catastrophic violence. On December 10, 1958, the two men entered the colony carrying a substantial quantity of dynamite and detonated it inside one of the community's main buildings during a gathering, in an act that killed themselves along with Krishna Venta and 8 other members of the colony. In an explosion powerful enough to be felt for miles around, and that instantly transformed the Fountain of the World from a locally admired disaster relief organization into the center of a horrifying act of mass violence that dominated Southern California headlines for weeks. The bombing brought the Fountain of the World's most dramatic and public chapter to a violent, sudden close. Though the community itself did not entirely dissolve in its immediate aftermath, continuing on in a diminished form under new leadership for a number of years afterward, gradually losing membership and public visibility until it faded, by the 1970s, into little more than a strange, largely forgotten footnote in the broader history of Southern California's remarkably fertile ecosystem of alternative religious movements, a landscape that would, in the decades following Venta's death, go on to produce a whole series of far more infamous groups that would eventually draw much heavier scrutiny and much wider public fascination. There is something particularly worth sitting within the story of Krishna Venta and the Fountain of the World, a detail that distinguishes it somewhat from many of the other movements you have already heard about tonight. This was not, in its outward public presentation, a colony that appeared threatening, isolated, or obviously dangerous to the outside world. Its members showed up with trucks full of supplies after wildfires. They dug through rubble after floods. They earned, through years of consistent, visible, genuinely useful public service, a level of community trust and goodwill that many other unconventional religious movements of the era, and of every era, never managed to achieve. And yet, underneath that carefully cultivated public image of wholesome service, the same fundamental dynamics of absolute authority, sexual exploitation, and total control over followers' lives that appear again and again throughout tonight's long history were quietly, steadily operating, hidden from the very neighbors who had come to admire the group's public works. It stands as an uncomfortable reminder that the outward face a movement presents to the world, however genuinely admirable that face might appear, tells you remarkably little about what is actually happening within the closed walls of the community itself. From the bombed ruins of that California canyon, we travel now backward in time once more, and across an entire ocean, to the volcanic hills of 18th century Naples, where a very different kind of prophet, promising not survival from apocalypse but a complete and total inversion of the moral order itself, gathered a small circle of aristocratic and educated followers around a philosophy so transgressive that it would eventually see him imprisoned, exiled, and largely erased from the history of the era, remembered now, if remembered at all, only in the footnotes of more academic accounts of the age's stranger religious currents. Actually, let's step back from Naples for a moment and turn, instead, to a story with a far richer and more reliable historical record, one that unfolded not in the shadows of academic footnotes, but in the full glare of national attention, in the rolling hardwood forests of upstate New York, where a brilliant, unconventional thinker built one of the most successful and most scandalous utopian communities America has ever produced. One that endured for more than 3 decades before quietly transforming itself, in one of history's more delightful ironies, into a company that still makes tableware sold in ordinary American homes to this very day. In the winter of 1848, a former Congregationalist minister named John Humphrey Noyes led a small group of devoted followers to a patch of land near the town of Oneida, in the rolling hill country of central New York, and began building a community founded on a set of ideas so radical, so thoroughly at odds with the conventions of 19th century American life, that they would generate outrage, fascination, and a level of sustained public curiosity that few religious experiments of the era could match. Noyes had arrived at his beliefs through years of intense theological study and personal spiritual struggle, eventually concluding that human beings, if sufficiently devoted and sufficiently disciplined, were capable of achieving genuine, complete spiritual perfection in this life, free from sin, here and now, rather than waiting for some distant heavenly reward after death. It was a doctrine that would come to be known as perfectionism, and it placed Noyes and his small circle of followers in direct, uncomfortable tension with virtually every mainstream Christian denomination of the period, all of which held that sinlessness in this earthly life was simply not achievable by ordinary, fallible human beings. Noyes did not arrive at these conclusions quietly or without cost. He had studied at Yale's theological seminary, where his increasingly unorthodox views eventually led to the revocation of his license to preach, a serious professional setback that would have ended the ambitions of a more conventional man. Instead, Noyes simply continued developing his theology independently, gathering a small circle of devoted followers first in his hometown of Putney, Vermont, where the community's early experiments with shared property, and eventually, shared intimate relationships between community members began generating exactly the kind of local scandal and legal trouble that would eventually force Noyes and his followers to relocate entirely, first fleeing prosecution on charges related to adultery, and ultimately settling on the more remote, more forgiving property near Oneida, New York, where they could build their community with considerably less immediate scrutiny from suspicious neighbors and local authorities. The community that took root at Oneida over the following years organized itself around a set of principles that Noyes had developed and refined over more than a decade of theological work, principles that touched every aspect of daily life within the settlement, from property and labor all the way through to the most intimate structures of family and sexual relationships. Perhaps the most immediately shocking of these principles, at least to outside observers, was what the community called complex marriage, a system in which every man in the community was considered, in a spiritual sense, married to every woman, and in which exclusive, possessive pair bonding between two individuals, the kind of conventional monogamous marriage that structured virtually all of respectable 19th century American society, was explicitly rejected as a form of selfish idolatry. An attachment to another human being that Noyes believed properly belonged only to God. It would be a serious misreading of the community's actual internal structure, however, to imagine complex marriage as some kind of unregulated free-for-all. In practice, intimate relationships within the Oneida community were governed by an elaborate, carefully maintained system of social permission and oversight, requiring the involvement of an intermediary, often an older, more established member of the community, to arrange and approve specific pairings, and the community placed particular emphasis on ensuring that older, more spiritually advanced members introduced younger members to intimate relationships, a practice that Noyes framed in the spiritual language of his theology, but that later historians, examining the power dynamics involved with considerably more critical distance, have identified as deeply troubling, particularly given that some of the younger members involved in these arranged introductions were, by any modern standard, still adolescents. Alongside complex marriage, the community also practiced a distinctive form of birth control that Noyes called male continence, a method requiring rigorous self-discipline that was intended to allow intimate relationships within the community without resulting in unplanned pregnancies, a genuinely significant departure from the conventional practices of the era, and one that Noyes justified through his broader theological framework, arguing that reproduction within the community should be a matter of careful, deliberate spiritual, and even, in later years, quasi-scientific planning, rather than simple biological chance. This latter conviction eventually developed into one of the community's most controversial later practices, a program Noyes called stirpiculture, in which the community's leadership selected specific pairings of members believed to possess particularly desirable spiritual and physical qualities, with the explicit goal of producing children who would represent an improved, more perfected generation, a program that, viewed through modern eyes, sits uncomfortably close to the pseudoscientific eugenic thinking that would go on to cause such enormous harm in the following century, even though Noyes's own framing of the program was rooted primarily in his particular theological understanding of human perfectibility, rather than in the racialized scientific eugenics movements that would emerge later. Beyond its intimate and reproductive practices, the Oneida community organized its daily economic and social life around principles of radical, thoroughgoing equality and shared labor that in some ways anticipated, and in other ways diverged sharply from, the various utopian socialist experiments that flourished across mid-19th century America. All property within the community was held in common, with individual members surrendering their personal wealth and possessions upon joining, and the fruits of the community's collective labor, which included a genuinely successful and diversified set of manufacturing enterprises, were shared among all members according to need rather than individual contribution or status. Perhaps most strikingly for the era, the community maintained a fairly consistent commitment to gender equality that stood in sharp contrast to conventional 19th century American society, with women within the community participating in business decision-making, wearing distinctive, considerably more practical clothing that abandoned the restrictive, elaborate fashions of the period in favor of shorter skirts worn over trousers, and taking on labor roles, including skilled trade work, that would have been considered scandalously unconventional for women almost anywhere else in the country at the time. One of the community's most distinctive, and by most surviving accounts, genuinely uncomfortable internal practices was a ritual Noyes called mutual criticism, a formalized process in which individual members would sit before either a small committee or, on more serious occasions, the entire assembled community, and receive frank, detailed, often harshly critical feedback on their character, their conduct, and their perceived spiritual and personal failings from their fellow community members. This practice served, within Noyes's broader theological framework, as a central mechanism of communal discipline and accountability, a way of ensuring that individual pride, selfishness, or moral laxity could be identified and corrected by the collective community rather than being left to fester unaddressed. Surviving accounts from former members describe the experience of sitting through a session of mutual criticism as often genuinely painful and humiliating, even as many of the same former members also described the practice, somewhat paradoxically, as having contributed to a real and unusual level of psychological transparency and mutual accountability within the community. A tool that bound members together through shared vulnerability, even as it exposed them to considerable social pressure, and, in the hands of a less careful leader, could easily have curdled into a mechanism of pure control and humiliation. What makes the Oneida community particularly remarkable and genuinely distinct from most of the other communities and movements you have heard about across tonight's long history is simply how long it endured and how economically successful it became during its more than 3 decades of existence. Unlike so many of the other utopian and religious experiments of the era, which tended to collapse within a few years under the weight of financial strain, internal conflict, or external persecution, the Oneida community developed a genuinely successful, diversified set of manufacturing businesses, most notably in the production of animal traps and eventually high-quality silverware and tableware, businesses that provided the community with real, sustained economic stability, and allowed it to grow to a peak population of several hundred members, drawing curious visitors and no small amount of scandalized newspaper coverage from across the country throughout the 1860s and 1870s. The community's eventual unraveling, when it finally came, arrived through a combination of internal generational tension and mounting external pressure rather than through any single dramatic catastrophe of the kind that ended so many of tonight's other stories. As the community's founding generation aged and Noyes himself grew older and increasingly unable to maintain the same degree of direct, hands-on leadership that had held the community together through its early decades, a younger generation of members, some of them Noyes' own children raised within the community's unconventional structure, began pushing for reform, particularly around the practice of complex marriage, which faced growing internal criticism as younger members increasingly desired the option of conventional, exclusive marriage relationships. Simultaneously, external pressure from surrounding communities and religious leaders, who had never fully reconciled themselves to the community's unconventional practices even during its decades of relatively peaceful coexistence with its neighbors, mounted steadily, eventually including public condemnation from prominent religious figures and the very real threat of formal legal prosecution on charges related to the community's intimate practices. Facing this combination of internal generational division and mounting external legal threat, Noyes made the decision, in 1879, to formally abandon the practice of complex marriage, and fled to Canada shortly afterward, reportedly to avoid the very real possibility of arrest and prosecution, living out his remaining years in comfortable but permanent exile just across the border from the community he had built and would never formally return to. Without Noyes' direct, unifying presence, and with complex marriage abandoned, the community's members spent the following 2 years working through the practical and legal complexities of transitioning away from their unconventional social structure, ultimately voting in 1881 to formally dissolve the religious community altogether and reorganize its considerable manufacturing assets into a conventional joint stock corporation, with individual shares distributed among the former community's members in rough proportion to their years of contributed labor and capital. That corporation, built on the foundation of the community's successful tableware manufacturing business, took the name Oneida Community Limited and would go on to become, over the following century, one of the most recognizable names in American tableware and silverware manufacturing, a company whose products sat, entirely unremarked upon by the ordinary American families who purchased them, in kitchen drawers across the country for generations. The vast majority of those customers having not the faintest idea that the brand name on their spoons and forks traced its origins back to one of the most radical, most sexually unconventional religious communities in American history. It remains one of history's more delightfully strange footnotes, a grand utopian experiment in complete spiritual and social transformation, resolving itself, in the end, into something as thoroughly ordinary and unremarkable as a well-made fork. There is a great deal worth sitting within the story of Oneida, because unlike so many of the movements you have already encountered tonight, this is not, on balance, a simple story of tragedy, violence, or catastrophic delusion. The community caused real and documented harm, particularly in its treatment of younger members within the arranged intimate relationships the community's structure enabled, harm that deserves to be named honestly rather than romanticized away simply because the community also achieved genuine economic success and avoided the kind of mass violence that consumed so many other movements across history. And yet the community also, by many surviving accounts, provided several hundred people with decades of genuine economic security, intellectual engagement, and a form of communal belonging that mainstream 19th century American society, with its rigid gender roles and its frequently precarious economic conditions for ordinary working families, simply did not offer to most of its members. It is a reminder, one final time before we move toward the close of tonight's long wander through history, that these movements rarely divide neatly into simple categories of purely villainous or purely tragic. Most of them, like most human enterprises of any kind, contain genuine conviction and genuine harm operating simultaneously, often within the very same set of practices, held by people who believed, with total and complete sincerity, that they had found a better way to live. From the forked drawers of ordinary American kitchens, we travel now back several decades earlier, to the farms and villages of rural New York and New England once more, where an unassuming, methodical farmer spent years poring over his Bible with the careful, patient attention of a man balancing a ledger, and arrived at a mathematical conclusion so startling that it would eventually convince tens of thousands of ordinary Americans to give away their possessions, abandon their harvests, and gather together to watch, with their own eyes, the end of the world arrive precisely on schedule. William Miller was, by almost every account that survives of him, a thoroughly unremarkable man for most of his life, which is precisely what makes his eventual influence so worth sitting with tonight. Born in Massachusetts in 1782 and raised largely in upstate New York, he grew up in modest circumstances, served as an officer during the War of 1812, and settled afterward into the steady, unglamorous life of a farmer in the small town of Low Hampton, New York, a life that gave no early indication whatsoever that he would eventually become one of the most influential religious figures of his era. For much of his younger adult life, Miller had drifted toward deism, a rationalist religious philosophy popular among some of the era's more educated thinkers that accepted the existence of a creator God, while rejecting most of the specific supernatural claims of organized Christianity. It was only in his early 30s, following his return from military service, that Miller experienced a profound religious conversion back toward evangelical Christianity, a conversion that soon developed into an intense, almost obsessive personal project of biblical study that would consume the following decades of his life. What set Miller apart from the countless other devout farmers and small-town preachers scattered across the young United States was the specific, methodical, almost mathematical approach he brought to his study of Scripture. Rather than simply reading the Bible devotionally, Miller approached it the way a careful accountant might approach a complicated set of financial records, cross-referencing specific numerical prophecies scattered throughout the books of Daniel and Revelation, comparing translations, calculating dates, and gradually constructing an elaborate interpretive framework that he became convinced could be used to calculate, with genuine mathematical precision, the actual year of Christ's promised return to earth. After years of this painstaking, self-directed study, conducted largely in isolation on his own farm without any formal theological training, Miller arrived at a conclusion that filled him with a mixture of profound awe and considerable personal terror. A calculation suggesting that the second coming of Christ and the end of the current earthly age would occur sometime around the year 1843. It is worth pausing here on just how much this particular detail. Miller's status as a calm, methodical, mathematically minded farmer rather than an ecstatic, wild-eyed street preacher contributed to the eventual, extraordinary success of the movement he would go on to build. Miller was not selling ecstasy, forbidden freedom, or dramatic visions of the kind that had characterized many of the other prophets you have already met tonight. He was offering, in effect, arithmetic, a calm, careful argument built from careful cross-referencing of biblical text, presented in the reassuring, unglamorous voice of a respectable farmer and veteran, rather than a wild-eyed fanatic. There is something uniquely persuasive, and in retrospect uniquely dangerous, about a calm, sober man with a pencil insisting that the numbers simply add up. For several years after arriving at his conclusion, Miller kept his calculations largely to himself, understandably hesitant to share such an extraordinary and potentially embarrassing claim with his neighbors and community. It was only in 1831, after years of private study and considerable internal wrestling with the weight of what he believed he had discovered, that Miller began sharing his findings publicly, first through a series of lectures delivered in small local churches near his home, and gradually, as word of his unusual and compelling message began to spread, through an expanding circuit of preaching engagements that carried him across a growing swath of the American Northeast. Miller's message found particularly fertile ground in a region and an era already primed for exactly this kind of intense religious expectation. The same burned-over district of upstate New York that had already produced Robert Matthews's Strange Kingdom, the early stirrings of the Latter-day Saint movement, and any number of smaller religious revivals, proved remarkably receptive to Miller's careful, methodical prophecy, and his following grew steadily throughout the 1830s and into the early 1840s. The movement that formed around Miller's teachings, which came to be known as Millerism, and whose adherents called themselves Adventists, in reference to their expectation of Christ's imminent second advent, grew dramatically once it gained the crucial support of a skilled and energetic promoter named Joshua Hims, a Boston preacher who brought genuine organizational and publicity skills to what had previously been a somewhat scattered grassroots movement built largely on Miller's own personal preaching tour. Under Hims' direction, the movement began publishing its own dedicated newspapers, organizing large camp meetings that drew thousands of attendees at a time, and distributing an extraordinary volume of printed pamphlets, charts, and prophetic literature across the country, in what amounted to one of the most sophisticated religious media and publicity operations of the era. A genuinely modern approach to movement building that helped Millerism reach an audience far beyond what Miller's own personal preaching circuit could ever have achieved on its own. By the early 1840s, as Miller's original calculated year of 1843 approached, the movement had grown into a genuine national phenomenon, with estimates of active Millerite believers ranging, according to different contemporary accounts, anywhere from 50,000 to considerably more than 100,000 people spread across the United States and parts of Canada, a genuinely enormous following for a religious movement built around a single, specific, testable prediction about the exact timing of the end of the world. As the calculated year approached, Miller himself, notably, never committed to a single specific day, having originally calculated only that the second coming would occur sometime within the roughly 12-month period beginning in March of 1843, a degree of imprecision that would prove crucial to how the movement's eventual disappointment unfolded, when March of 1843 arrived and passed without incident. And the following months continued to pass in the same thoroughly ordinary fashion. Miller and his followers did not immediately abandon their conviction. Instead, following further recalculation and consultation among the movement's leadership, the expected window was extended slightly, eventually settling on a final, specific, and considerably more precise date of October 22nd, 1844, a date arrived at through a further refinement of the original biblical calculations by one of the movement's other prominent preachers, a date that would come to be remembered in American religious history with a plain, aching honesty that few religious movements have ever matched in describing their own failure. In the weeks and days leading up to October 22nd, 1844, the intensity of belief among the movement's most devoted followers reached a fever pitch that is genuinely difficult to fully convey. Contemporary accounts, collected by historians in the decades since, describe believers across New England, upstate New York, and beyond engaging in behavior that reflected an absolutely total, unwavering conviction that the ordinary rules of earthly life were about to become permanently irrelevant. Farmers reportedly left crops unharvested in the fields, reasoning that there was little point in gathering a harvest for a world that would not exist to eat it. Some believers settled their outstanding debts, gave away money and possessions to friends, neighbors, and the poor, and closed their businesses entirely. Families gathered together in homes, in churches, and at large outdoor camp meetings, dressed, according to some later, though historically disputed and possibly somewhat exaggerated, popular accounts, in white robes intended for their ascension, waiting through the night of October 22nd with a mixture of trembling terror and genuine, overwhelming joy, fully expecting the sky itself to open before the following morning arrived. The morning of October 23rd, 1844, arrived instead in the most thoroughly ordinary way imaginable. The sun rose, birds sang. Farmers who had failed to bring in their harvests looked out over fields that would now need to be gathered in considerably more difficult and delayed conditions. Families who had given away their possessions and closed their businesses in joyful anticipation of eternal glory found themselves instead facing the distinctly earthly, distinctly unglamorous problem of how to rebuild an ordinary material life they had confidently expected never to need again. The devastation and grief that swept through the movement's followers in the days and weeks that followed was so profound, so total, that it was given its own name by the believers themselves, a name that has survived in the historical record with a plainness that captures something genuinely moving about how honestly these people faced their own catastrophic error. They called it, simply and without any attempt to soften the blow, the Great Disappointment. Surviving letters and diary entries from Millerite believers in the immediate aftermath of October 22nd, 1844, describe a grief so total that it is genuinely difficult to read even at this distance of nearly 2 centuries. One of the movement's own prominent preachers, writing shortly after the failed date, described weeping until he could weep no more, describing a level of sorrow that made him wish, in his own words, that he might sleep and never wake to face the world again. This was not embarrassment at having been publicly, humiliatingly wrong, though there was certainly a great deal of that as well, particularly given how much public ridicule the movement had already attracted from skeptical newspapers throughout its final build-up toward the promised date. It was something closer to genuine grief, the grief of having believed with absolute and total sincerity that a beloved and glorious reality was about to arrive, and finding instead that the ordinary, difficult, unglamorous world had simply continued on exactly as before. What happened next, in the years immediately following the Great Disappointment, offers one of the clearest and most genuinely fascinating illustrations of a pattern that appears throughout tonight's long history. The discovery, made independently by grieving believers across dozens of different failed prophetic movements, across dozens of different centuries and continents, that a spectacularly failed prophecy does not, in fact, always destroy the underlying faith that produced it. It often, instead, transforms that faith into something new, as the believing mind reaches for a way to preserve the core of its conviction, even as the specific prediction that gave rise to it collapses entirely. Miller himself, for his part, responded to the failure of his calculations with what most historians regard as genuine, dignified humility, acknowledging publicly that he had been mistaken in his specific date calculations, while maintaining, until his own death several years later, his underlying conviction that Christ's return remained imminent, simply not precisely calculable through the methods he had originally employed. He did not attempt to explain away the failure through elaborate reinterpretation, nor did he attempt to set a new specific date, conduct that stands in fairly stark and admirable contrast to a number of other failed prophets across history, who doubled down with increasingly elaborate justifications rather than acknowledging error. Many of Miller's original followers, understandably, simply abandoned the movement entirely in the aftermath of the Great Disappointment, drifting back into more conventional denominations or abandoning organized religious practice altogether, their trust in prophetic calculation permanently shattered by the experience. But a meaningful number of the movement's most devoted believers did not simply walk away. Instead, small groups of former Millerites began meeting together in the months and years following the failed prophecy, working through the theological wreckage of what had happened and gradually developing new interpretive frameworks that allowed them to preserve their underlying faith while accounting for the specific failure of the October 1844 date. One particularly influential strand of this post-disappointment reinterpretation developed in considerable part through the visionary experiences and prolific writings of a young former Millerite believer named Ellen G. White, concluded that the calculated date itself had actually been correct, but that the event Miller and his followers had expected to occur on Earth had, in fact, occurred instead in a heavenly, rather than earthly, location, marking the beginning of a different and less immediately visible phase of divine activity, rather than the literal, visible second coming the movement had originally expected. This reinterpretation, developed and refined over the following years by White and her fellow former Millerites, eventually formed the theological foundation of what would become the Seventh-day Adventist Church, a denomination that formally organized in the early 1860s and that continues to exist as a substantial, well-established, and entirely mainstream Christian denomination to this very day, with millions of members worldwide operating hospitals, schools, and publishing houses across dozens of countries. It stands as one of history's more remarkable examples of a movement transforming a total, public, humiliating prophetic failure into the foundation of an enduring, stable, and ultimately quite conventional religious institution. A genuinely striking outcome when set alongside so many of the other failed prophetic movements scattered throughout tonight's long history, most of which simply collapsed entirely once their central predictions failed to materialize. There is something worth sitting with one final time before we move toward the close of tonight's long wander through history in the particular shape of the Millerite story. Unlike so many of the other movements you have heard about tonight, this was not a story that ended in violence, exploitation, or mass tragedy. It ended, instead, in the specific, very human experience of total, public disappointment, followed by the equally human, equally universal impulse to somehow salvage meaning from the wreckage of a shattered expectation, rather than simply accepting that the wreckage meant nothing at all. William Miller was, by every available account, a sincere, decent, careful man who made an honest and catastrophic error in his interpretation of an ancient text, and who bore the public consequences of that error with a dignity that many far more cynical and self-interested prophets across history have entirely failed to match. His followers were not fools. They were ordinary farmers, shopkeepers, and families who wanted, more than anything, to believe that the difficult, uncertain world around them was about to be replaced by something clearer, something more just, something more glorious, and who were willing to give away their harvests and their savings on the strength of that hope. The world did not end on October 22, 1844. But the hope that had gathered around that date, however painfully disappointed, did not simply vanish either. It reshaped itself, as hope so often does throughout the long, strange history you have heard tonight, into something new, something that endures in its own quiet, considerably less apocalyptic form in ordinary American communities to this very day. And so, as the candle burns low and the fields outside your window sit quiet and undisturbed by any promised apocalypse, we come near the end of tonight's long wander through history's forgotten movements, its failed prophets, and its sincere, frightened, hopeful believers. Before we let the night close entirely, there is one more story worth sitting with, because it took place not in the distant fog of the ancient world or the unfamiliar hills of a foreign continent, but in the ordinary, sun-baked orange groves of 20th century Florida, within living memory of people who might, right now, be listening to this very recording. It is the story of a small, strange, and by most measures quite peaceful community built entirely around the conviction of one woman that she had died, been resurrected, and returned to earth in a body that would never age and could never truly die again. In 1908, a woman named Mildred Baker, born into a Methodist family in the American South, began experiencing a series of intense religious visions that would eventually transform her into one of the more genuinely unusual religious leaders in American history. A woman who would go on to build an entire self-sustaining religious community in Central Florida around the claim that she had achieved literal, physical immortality. She took, over the course of her transformation, a new and considerably more dramatic name, becoming known to her small but devoted following as Sister Sunshine, later adjusted by the community itself to a title that reflected her claimed spiritual status more fully. And by the time her movement reached its peak in the 1920s and 1930s, she governed a genuinely functioning, self-sufficient religious colony that drew curious visitors, newspaper reporters, and a small but steady stream of devoted converts from across the country. Sister Sunshine's core theological claim, the one around which her entire community and its way of life was organized, was disarmingly simple in its basic structure, even as its implications proved genuinely radical. She taught that she had, at a specific point in her earlier religious life, actually died, that her earthly, mortal body had ceased to function entirely, and that God had subsequently resurrected her, not into some distant future heavenly existence, but directly back into her own physical body, now transformed into an immortal, imperishable form that would never again experience illness, aging, or death. She taught further that this same transformation was available in principle to any of her followers who achieved a sufficiently complete state of spiritual purity and unwavering faith, a promise that offered something genuinely unprecedented among the various American religious movements of the era, not eternal life in some distant afterlife, but the tangible, physical, testable promise of never dying at all, right here in this world, in this very body. The community she built to embody this teaching took root on a substantial parcel of land in Central Florida, where followers who joined her movement typically surrendered their outside property and income to the community's shared resources, took up residence in simple communal housing, and organized their daily lives around a combination of agricultural labor, tending the citrus groves and vegetable gardens that provided much of the community's food and modest income. An intensive religious devotion centered on Sister Sunshine's teachings and her regular, closely attended sermons. The community developed a reputation, largely accurate by most surviving accounts, for genuine industriousness and self-sufficiency, its members working the land with real dedication and maintaining a settlement that, from the outside, presented an image of orderly, productive, communal harmony, considerably more wholesome in appearance than the popular imagination typically associates with unconventional religious movements of the era. What made Sister Sunshine's community a genuine object of national fascination rather than simply one more small, obscure religious settlement among the many that dotted early 20th century America, was the specific, testable nature of her core theological claim. A movement promising eventual salvation in some distant, unverifiable afterlife invites belief or skepticism that can never really be settled one way or another within a believer's own lifetime. A movement promising literal physical immortality, however, invites a very different and considerably more uncomfortable kind of scrutiny, because eventually, inevitably, biology has its say regardless of theology's confidence. For a number of years, the community thrived under exactly this cloud of both fascination and quiet skepticism, drawing regular newspaper coverage that oscillated between genuine curiosity about the group's unusual beliefs and gentle, sometimes not so gentle, mockery of a movement whose central claim seemed, to outside observers, so plainly destined to eventually collide with the ordinary facts of human mortality. Sister Sunshine herself, for her part, aged visibly across the decades of her leadership, a detail her devoted followers explained through increasingly elaborate theological reasoning, arguing that her continued presence among them in an aging body represented a kind of voluntary spiritual sacrifice, a deliberate choice to remain visibly connected to her mortal followers rather than fully manifesting the imperishable glory her resurrection had genuinely granted her. A piece of doctrinal flexibility that echoes, in its basic shape, the same kind of reinterpretation that allowed the Millerites to preserve their faith in the aftermath of their own failed prophecy decades earlier. The community's central theological claim finally, inevitably, faced its ultimate test in the early 1940s, when Sister Sunshine, after several years of visibly declining health that her followers had explained through increasingly strained theological argument, died. It was, by any ordinary measure, exactly the kind of definitive, unambiguous failure of a core prophetic claim that had ended so many other movements throughout tonight's long history in immediate and total collapse. And yet, remarkably, echoing once again the same pattern you have now encountered across multiple centuries and multiple continents throughout tonight's long wander through forgotten belief, a meaningful portion of her following did not simply abandon their faith in the face of this seemingly unanswerable contradiction. Instead, the community's remaining leadership developed a reinterpretation, arguing that Sister Sunshine's physical death represented not a failure of her original resurrection and immortality, but rather a further, still deeper spiritual transformation, a voluntary final ascension into a purely spiritual form of continued existence that transcended even the immortal physical body she had previously inhabited. The community persisted for a number of years following her death under this reinterpreted theology, gradually shrinking in membership as the founding generation of believers aged and died in the entirely ordinary, unmysterious way that human beings generally do, with insufficient new converts arriving to replace them, until the settlement finally dissolved entirely by the middle of the 20th century, its land sold, its remaining buildings repurposed, its unusual history fading gradually into the kind of obscure, half-remembered local folklore that so many of tonight's smaller stories eventually settle into. Remembered now mostly by local historians and the occasional curious researcher who stumbles across a yellowed newspaper clipping in a Florida archive. There is a particular kind of poignancy worth sitting within the story of Sister Sunshine and her small immortal colony, a poignancy that connects backward through nearly every story you have heard across this long night. Here again is the same fundamental human hunger that has appeared in one form or another in every single movement across tonight's journey, the hunger to escape the single hardest, most universal, most unavoidable fact of human existence, the fact that everyone we love, and eventually we ourselves, will die. Every civilization across every century of recorded history has produced its own version of a story promising an exception to that fact, whether through resurrection, ascension, reincarnation, or the specific literal bodily immortality that Sister Sunshine offered her small community of Florida followers. The promise never quite survives contact with the actual, stubborn facts of biology. And yet the hunger that produces the promise never seems to fully disappear either, resurfacing generation after generation, century after century, in new costumes, new locations, and new theological language, but always reaching for the exact same thing, some way, any way, to make the unbearable fact of mortality feel a little less final, a little less absolute, a little more negotiable than it actually is. And so, as we finally near the end of tonight's long wander through more than 2,000 years of human belief, hope, desperation, and sincere, sometimes catastrophic conviction, it is worth taking a few final, quiet minutes to sit with everything we have walked through together tonight. From a hermit on a donkey leading thousands of hopeful pilgrims to their deaths, to children marching toward a sea that would not part for them, to a mountain fortress where the very last defenders of a doomed cause chose the manner of their own end, to a small Connecticut town consumed by fear of witches hiding among its own trusted neighbors, to a failed scholar whose fevered visions ignited the deadliest civil war in human history, to a Manhattan carpenter who convinced a grieving merchant that God himself now spoke through an ordinary human voice, to a canyon colony that mixed genuine, admirable disaster relief work with hidden exploitation and ultimately violent tragedy, to an upstate New York community that transformed radical, controversial ideas about marriage and property into one of history's more successful utopian experiments before quietly becoming a maker of ordinary household silverware, to a calm, careful farmer whose mathematics convinced tens of thousands of Americans the world would end on a specific October morning. And finally, to a Florida colony built entirely around one woman's conviction that she alone, among all of humanity, had already conquered death itself. Notice, now that you have heard the whole long procession of these stories, how remarkably little the underlying human material actually changes from one to the next, however different the costumes, the centuries, and the continents involved might be. Strip away the robes, the visions, the mathematics, the communal marriages, the disaster relief trucks, and the citrus groves, and underneath every single one of these stories you find the same small handful of entirely ordinary human aches over and over again. The fear of a world that has stopped making sense. The grief of loss that demands some kind of explanation, any explanation, rather than senseless, meaningless randomness. The loneliness of a life that feels unwitnessed and unimportant. The desperate, universal human hunger to matter, to be chosen, to be part of something larger and more significant than an ordinary, unremarkable life lived, and then simply ended. These are not exotic afflictions belonging to distant history, to the credulous, uneducated masses of some less sophisticated past era. They are the same aches that live quietly in every ordinary person listening to this very recording tonight. Notice, too, as this long night finally draws to its close, how rarely the followers in these stories were actually the fools that popular imagination likes to imagine when it pictures the word cult. Elijah Pearson was a wealthy, successful New York merchant. William Miller's followers included careful, methodical farmers who approached his mathematics with the same seriousness they brought to their own account books. Educated professionals and prosperous families joined Krishnaventa's colony in the hills above Los Angeles and stood shoulder to shoulder with their neighbors clearing rubble after floods and wildfires. The capacity to be swept up entirely into a conviction that later generations will find strange, even tragic, is not a defect belonging to some separate category of gullible, foolish people, fundamentally different from the rest of us. It is, uncomfortably, simply a standard feature of the human mind under sufficient pressure, sufficient grief, or sufficient hope, and the appropriately honest response to that realization, sitting here now in the safety and comfort of your own bed, is not smugness or superiority, but a quiet, humbling humility. And yet, even as tonight's stories are so often shadowed by tragedy, exploitation, and catastrophic, sometimes lethal error. It would be a mistake to let this long night end on nothing but darkness, because tangled up inescapably in nearly every one of these stories is something genuinely admirable as well, something worth honoring even as we remain honestly clear-eyed about the harm these movements so often caused. The same impulse that led thousands of desperate people to march toward Jerusalem also produced, across other centuries, extraordinary communities of mutual care, genuine equality, and shared purpose. The same hunger for meaning that convinced a failed Chinese scholar he was the literal brother of Christ also inspired programs of land reform and genuine, sincere concern for the suffering of the poor. The same longing that led Millerite farmers to give away their harvests in joyful anticipation of paradise also produced, in the aftermath of their crushing disappointment, one of America's most enduring and genuinely constructive religious denominations, one that continues to this day, running hospitals and schools across the world. The longing for meaning that a false or mistaken prophet can so easily exploit is, disquietingly, the very same longing that produces art. Community, sacrifice, and genuine hope. It is one single human root, and history shows us, again and again, that it bears both kinds of fruit at once, the beautiful and the devastating, often growing from the very same branch. So the purpose of a long night like this one is not, in the end, to teach you to look back at all these believers with mockery or condescension from the comfortable safety of hindsight. It is something quieter and considerably more useful than mockery could ever be. It is simply to help you recognize the underlying shape of the pattern, wherever and whenever you might happen to encounter it again in your own life, in whatever new costume it happens to be wearing. A voice that has grown just a little too certain of itself. A circle of belonging that makes you feel just a little too specially chosen among all the ordinary people around you. A promise that sounds just a touch too perfect, too complete, too total, and that asks, gently and reasonably, for just a little bit of trust to begin with. The warning signs across every single story you have heard tonight were almost always gentle at first, arriving slowly, one small reasonable step at a time, right up until, quite suddenly, they weren't gentle at all anymore. But that is a thought for the daylight, for the fully awake and alert version of you that does not need to carry it any further tonight. Right now, in this quiet, comfortable dark, there is nothing left to decide, and genuinely nothing left to fear. Every single prophet in tonight's long procession of stories is long gone now, their kingdoms fallen, their calculations disproven, their canyons and communal houses and citrus groves either vanished entirely or transformed into something else, something ordinary. Ownership passed quietly on to families who have not the faintest idea what once stood there. All that remains of any of them now are these strange, sincere, sometimes heartbreaking stories. And you, warm and safe in your own bed, holding them lightly, drifting gently towards sleep as this long night finally, quietly comes to its close. Let it go now. Rest easy. Whatever tomorrow brings, it will not require you to march anywhere to give away anything, or to wait on any mountaintop for a promise that will not arrive. The world did not end tonight. It will simply, quietly, ordinarily still be here waiting for you in the morning. Good night.